Good morning. I am Jim Kahn. I'm from the Institute for Health Policy Studies at UCSF, and very pleased that we could have this session jointly sponsored by IHPS and the School of Pharmacy. Milou Hogervorst, my best attempt at pronouncing her name in the proper way, is a master's student in the Netherlands and joined me to look at a critical issue in the cost of implementing single-payer healthcare in the United States, which is what kind of savings might be possible in the cost of drugs. So, Milou?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction, Jim, and thank you all for coming. So, as Jim said, I'm Milou, and I'm a Dutch master's student in pharmacy, and I'm here basically to write my master's thesis at Jim's group, which has been great so far, and I'm really excited because this is the first time that I will actually present my work. So any questions, recommendations, or things that are unclear, I would really love to hear that. And for the rest, I would like to ask you to save your questions for until the end. So unless things are really not clear, we can have like a discussion with questions in the end. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you today. Well, first I will dig a little bit in the problem of the U.S. healthcare costs to to give a little background, and then also about the proposed solution, the single-payer system. So I will get to that, and after that, my research consists of two parts. First, a qualitative part and then a quantitative part. And I will briefly discuss the qualitative part, but I think the last part is more interesting, so I will basically focus on that. Of course, a conclusion in the end, and then we will have about 20 minutes for your questions and discussions, any things that are unclear from your side. So I think most of you will be familiar with this picture. Anybody seen it before? Yeah, well, I thought it was quite shocking because this is about the total healthcare spending, and as you can see in the US, like almost twice compared to other countries, the US spends about twice the amount of money on healthcare, and I see I included some other big countries and also countries that are, as we say, equally wealthy. So this is a share of the GDP, and I guess you're all familiar with that. And about 12% of this healthcare cost goes to pharmaceutical. So that's quite a share. And I also wanted to illustrate that. These are two of the top-selling antidiabetic drugs. I'm not sure if you can see the lighter and the darker bars, but the first bar, this one, is the WAC price, which is the list price that the manufacturer charges the wholesaler, basically. And the first one is without any rebates. And in America, we have a big system where the manufacturers give money back to the wholesalers afterwards. And these rebates can get as high as 50%. So the other price is the same WAC price, but then including rebates. But you see, even if they get a discount or a rebate, still the price is way higher than in all the other countries for both drugs. So to summarize these two pictures, there are two problems, basically. In the first one, you could see that healthcare costs in general are rising. Because our population is changing, there are more elderly people and more chronic diseases that have to be treated. So that's one part of the problem, why healthcare costs are rising. And the second problem is that in the US, the healthcare costs are rising way faster than in every other country. So that's basically the problem happening in the US right now. And there are a couple of reasons that I identified why healthcare costs are rising so fast here in the US. Because first of all, it may sound very logical, but prices are higher. It's not necessarily the utilization of the drugs, so people don't use more drugs than in other countries, but just they pay more for the drugs that they get. And this is, of course, possible through all the patents that are on the drugs. So it's basically most brand name drugs. And on top of that, the prices of these drugs grow very fast. It's very normal for a drug to increase their price by 10% each year. So therefore, the costs grow faster than the inflation. Another reason is the American system with the rebates. Are you all familiar with the pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen that negotiate rebates on behalf of the payers? Well, they have a kind of structure where they earn a share of the rebates that they negotiate. So they have a very big incentive to negotiate higher drug prices in order to get a higher rebate. And this group is the second largest rent-seeking group in the US, besides all the tech companies like Apple and Google. So people estimated it to be 4% of total healthcare costs goes to rent-seeking. And then there is not a lot of measures in order to contain the cost, because federal agencies are not allowed to use the quality adjusted life years or ICERs in order to perform HTA, like the health technology assessment or cost effectiveness analysis. And it has been proven that countries who use cost effectiveness analysis pay a little bit less for their drugs. So not allowing federal payers to do so gives them not enough tools to actually negotiate prices down and to estimate the value of the drug. Another big problem, I guess, is that Medicare is not even allowed to negotiate on their drug prices. So I think they have to pay whatever is charged. And one of the reasons that might sound a bit unexpected is the best price that they charge for Medicaid and the Veteran Affairs. Well, for the Veteran Affairs, it's not called the best price, but basically works the same, that they're promised the lowest price. But the industry uses this as a tool to set a minimum price, and all the other prices are per definition going to be higher. So this is basically a tool for the industry to increase prices. So the solution that is proposed by, well, amongst others, Bernie Sanders and a lot of other more left-wing people is the single-payer system. And also the organizations like the WHO propose it as a good system because it has a big pooled funding, which is very capable of catching financial shocks. And what they now proposed is a quasi-public system, so it's government-run, but it's like a designated institution that will pay the healthcare costs on behalf of the government. Will be not-for-profit and financed by taxes paid by the public. Providers would remain private, so there will still be freedom of choice for which doctor you want to go to. And this single payer would have one formulary with a list of preferred drugs, which gives physicians like a guide what to prescribe and what not in order to contain costs. And the single payer would also integrate or take over the tasks of the PBM, so they would negotiate drug prices for themselves. So the incentives would change a little bit. So I listed some ways in which the single payer could save money. I mean, what people often say is that the implementation and a potential reduction of efficiency would also cost money, but the lower administrative cost and lower drug costs due to negotiation leverage will hopefully reduce the cost more than they will increase by the new system. So the aim of my study is in a single payer system, we will need new ways to price the drugs because there's no free market anymore. So first of all, I try to identify possible strategies to price drugs and to contain costs under a single payer system. And second, I chose 3 strategies to quantify in order to see how big the effect would be of the cost savings. And to do so, I used a set of antidiabetic drugs as a case study. because that accounts for a very big share of all the pharmaceutical cost. I think almost about 10%, which is the number one cost for our pharmaceuticals. And almost 10% of the American citizens suffers from diabetes. So it has a very big impact on many US citizens. So first of all, I will start with the qualitative assessment. So I wanted to identify some solutions which are suitable for a single-payer system. And I used two strategies to do so. I started with a lot of interviews, and I listed, this is the pointer, like all the stakeholders which I've interviewed. I think I catched almost every step in the pharmaceutical chain, all the stakeholders, except for, well, quite obvious, I guess, the insurers and pharmacy benefit managers, because it's not in their interest to support this project, so it was very difficult to get in touch with them. And from them, I got a bit of a feeling of what people thought that would be good solutions and how this would work in a single payer and what the hurdles would be. And after that, I did a systematic literature search in order to gather some facts on the strategies that I found and also to supplement it with additional strategies. And this is what I found. Well, I found many more strategies, but these are the ones that were best suitable for a single payer. Well, I'm not going to name them all. That's going to be a bit boring, I guess. But I highlighted the three that I identified for quantification. Yeah, you see, I ordered them by step in the pharmaceutical chain, so at which point in the system they would have to change. So the three that I wanted to quantify is more switching to generics and more switching to cheaper alternatives, so switching from drug classes. The effect of having a formulary with preferred drugs, and setting a price growth gap, because I mentioned the 10% that drugs sometimes grow per year, yeah, which is kind of ridiculous, I would say. So a price growth gap could prevent that. So like I said, there were many more strategies. These were the best suitable in a single payer system. And the selection for quantification, I did that based on both data availability, because of course you need the data to quantify something, and the expected effects of the strategy. And also, many of these strategies are not like solo strategies. They are linked to each other and they will affect each other. I will come back to that later. So then I want to go to the second part, the quantification, which I think is the most interesting part. So here are the three strategies, and I want to start with the effect of the formulary. And for this, I used the VA as an example, because the VA has a closed system with a formulary with preferred drugs, which works quite well because they educate their physicians about it. And I think when a drug is on their preferred formulary list, the prescription rate of those drugs is almost like 80 to 90% market share. So as soon as a drug is on the list, physicians will prescribe those drugs instead of others. So very briefly, I want to tell you the data that I gathered. Maybe it's a bit boring, but I thought it might be important to get the rest of the story. So I've got some numbers, the total US population, which is about 325 million people, of which 10% are estimated to have diabetes. This is 2015 data, by the way. I see I wrote down 2017, but it's 2015. So, and 6% of those 10%, of the full population, so 6% is diagnosed and gets treatment. So that's a lot less. The 10%, also a lot of people are undiagnosed. And the annual amount of prescriptions is about 350 per year. So I use that number to calculate like a budget impact. And then the market value, so the revenue of all the diabetes drugs that are sold, is about $32 billion US dollar a year. So I gathered the prices, like I mentioned before, the WAC price, which is listed by the Red Book, and from the Veteran Affairs I always also gather prices which they call the Federal Supply Scheme prices, so the FSS. So I think I will use this abbreviation more in the presentation if you see it, that's surprised that the VA pays for the drugs. And I converted that into a price per daily defined dose. So basically what 1 day of drug utilization would cost. And I separated that for generics and brands. Then the prescribing volumes in order to calculate like a weight average, and the sales to calculate some rebates, because since that's almost 50% of the price, I thought it's good to account for that in the calculations. And what I found is that on average, 45% of the price is a rebate, so will be given back to the wholesalers and pharmacy benefit managers. So 45% on all brand name drugs, and if you take all drugs together, that would be on average 38% of the price, which is a rebate, which I thought is quite a big proportion. So I think this is my most difficult slide. I will try to explain this as best as I can. Well, to start here, first, these 2 bars are the WAC prices. And I made 2 lists of drugs, one that are on the VA formulary, one that are not on the VA formulary. So the drugs that are not on the formulary, in general, are higher than the drugs that are on the formulary. So this is kind of a basis price difference because you use different drugs. Then I looked at the VA prices, and I basically did the same. So it's a difference in difference analysis. Also in the VA, the drugs that are on the formulary, that are not on the formulary, are higher than the drugs that are on the formulary. But if you see how much the price difference is in percentages, these are the last 2 bars, is higher in the VA than the basis price. So I considered this difference due to the negotiation leverage because they have a formulary. This is like an additional discount that they negotiate because their drugs are on the formulary. And if you apply that extra discount to the WAC prices, which I did here, you see that the price drops from, let's say, $5.30 to $3.80 per daily defined dose. So this is adjusted for the prescribing volumes. And that is about a 28% reduction in price. So if you calculate that over all antidiabetics, in 2017, $9.1 billion could have been saved if they would have negotiated according to a national formulary. Yeah, and I did some sensitivity analysis, and I found a spread between 8.2 and $10 billion. But I thought it was kind of complicated to explain in a half-an-hour presentation. But if you have more questions about this, I'm happy to answer them. So what the manufacturers say is that they can give such big rebates to the VA because they're so small. And if they have to do that for the entire country, they're not able to. So perhaps if you would negotiate for either an entire state or the entire country, the effect would be slightly different. And also what I found is, I mentioned that I calculated like a total cost as a budget impact. And if I use the numbers that I found, so the $5.30, the total spending exceeds what is actually paid in total. So I mentioned the $32 billion a year. What I found is like a $50 billion a year. But I thought it might be due to the defined daily dose, which I used, which is probably way higher than what people actually use. So therefore, the prices might be a little bit lower. So these were two discussion points that I found. Then I want to go to the second strategy, which is also an effect of the national formulary, which can help physicians to guide towards cheaper prescribing, so either generics or cheaper alternatives. So I calculated, again, the weighted average, but I did that twice, one with the prescription volumes as they are right now, and one with prescription volumes if you switch to more generics and more cheaper alternatives. And for this, I also used the VA as an example because they're way better at it than the commercial plans are. Yeah, and if you compare those two weighted averages, you get the amount of savings, which I found to be $9 billion annually. But since I used VA data, and that was rather old, from 2008, a lot of things have changed since then. There are a lot of new generation prescription drugs for which there are no generics available. So therefore I thought probably the generic prescription rate in the VA also declined a little bit. So I changed these volumes, and also the VA uses more human insulins instead of insulin analogs, which are way more expensive. And I think that also switched a little bit since 2008, since it did basically everywhere, due to less side effects and stuff like that. So the 9 billion that you see in the black bar, that's what I found based on the numbers that I found. And then I varied the different volumes until like the per class volumes were exactly the same as used in commercial plans, except for a higher rate of generic prescription. So the 1.4 billion is the amount that could be saved if you would just switch to cheaper generics. Yeah, like I said, the data was kind of old. There was no more recent data. That's why I varied the prescribing volumes so much to see what the effect would be. And in order to educate your physicians about more generic prescribing, because that can be a little bit difficult with a formulary, because the formulary doesn't say you need to prescribe this generic or that generic, but just usually an active pharmaceutical ingredient to prescribe. You need to educate your doctors about what to prescribe and what is most cheap, and especially for biopharmaceuticals. And I think that will get more difficult on a larger scale. Like in the VA, that's, I think, pretty doable, but I think if you would do that for the entire US, it might become more difficult. And because both of these strategies are due to a national formulary, I also combined these savings, which is a very simple calculation. I just took the total spending that I found, times the savings on price reductions and the savings from switching to cheaper alternatives. And then I got this bar. In the most likely scenario, I see that the lines are a bit light, so you cannot see that. But the most likely scenario, so where in the VA they also switched a little bit to the more expensive drugs, and the average of the first strategy, I found that 11.6 billion aggregated could be saved. And this is the worst case scenario. And the best case scenario, which is because of the spread that I showed in the previous slides. Well, of course, you could question if the effect of both would be the same if you apply both strategies at the same time. And also what I mentioned before, on a larger scale, it really is like the question whether pharmaceutical companies can give those amount of discounts to such a large country. And then the last strategy that I want to discuss, this is just about insulins. And the fun fact is that recently there was a lawsuit filed against the 3 pharmaceutical companies that produce the insulins because of these price increases. What you see is the red line is the inflation rate in the US, and all the other lines are the price increases of insulins. So you see that almost 250% price increase over 10 years. That's like the 10% that I meant. Prices increase very heavily. And now a lawsuit is filed because many people cannot afford their insulins. And they are in the, how do you call that, the donut hole gap. So what I did here is I calculated new prices based on this inflation rate. So if there would have been a growth gap that would say prices cannot grow faster than the average inflation of the country, then the price growth would follow this line. So I calculated new prices and I calculated the area under the curve in order to find the savings. And this is what I found. And this might look a bit strange, this wiggle. But the inflation rate is a very smooth growing line. But I also applied the rebates that I found on the prices, and those were only available per year. And from 2010 to 2012, the rebates increased very much. So they increased more than the inflation grew. So therefore you see this drop in the growth. And the first graph, you see the savings per year, which grow per year, and here I accumulated all the savings. So there you can see in 10 years what could have been saved if it would have followed the inflation rate. And I thought, just because it's funny to see the difference, these would have been the prices of the insulins if they would have followed the inflation rate. And sometimes prices can be like 4 times lower, which I think is a very, very big difference. Yeah, well, one point is that inflation rate is based on the consumer price index, and the consumer price index also includes the healthcare cost growth. So basically it's an underestimation of the effect because you already take into account the growth of healthcare costs. So for your information, I summarized my findings. For the first 2 strategies, you see that like almost $9 billion could have been saved in 2017. And if you take them together, there's a spread between 9.2 and 16.2 billion that could have been saved due to these strategies. And also growth control, yeah, it's kind of difficult to match it with this, but it's just a different strategy to contain costs. Could have saved 4.7 billion just for insulins. So the first 3 are for all antidiabetics, and this is just for insulins, 4.7 billion. And I thought these were quite astonishing numbers that I found. I got some general discussion points about the results that I found in the single-payer system, because I think the first thing that opposition would say is the concern about the incentives for investment in pharmaceuticals. Right now, it's a very profitable industry, so there's a lot of investment, which maybe not always in the right way, but it keeps innovation going. And if you would drop the prices very heavily, then could be that investors are not interested anymore. And as is seen with the antibiotics, that's very difficult because they're all placed, in Dutch we would say on the shelf to keep them in case other antibiotics wouldn't work anymore. But you see that the investment dropped immediately. So people mentioned that concern. And in addition to that, a single payer could have the same effect as a merger of large buyers. So if you don't have the right amount of competition stimulation, it could rule out competition, which would again increase prices. Besides that, a small point is that I did not distinguish between diabetes type 1 or 2 patients, which have slightly different utilization of drugs. think diabetes type 1 patients use more insulins and less oral antidiabetics, but it's only a small proportion in the entire group. So I think these differences are minimal. And I didn't even mention half of my assumptions that I made during the calculations. And based on the rebates and everything that I showed, this shows the necessity of more transparency, because yeah, there's so much that is unknown, and it's not for research like this, but it's also to make the system more simple, because right now pharmaceutical companies and also the middlemen, they can hide behind all the rules to have little tricks and tactics to increase prices without people really knowing it. And if it would be a more simple, transparent system, I think that would help get more insight in prices and how people got to the prices, and also for physicians what they can prescribe, and for the patients. So to conclude, I found many strategies that are possible, which would result in savings. And I quantified only 3, and these 3 indicate that a 30% saving, at least on antidiabetics, is possible. So if this same amount of savings is possible for all drugs, I think that a single payer would save more money than it would cost to implement. I don't know exactly what it would cost, that's a different field of study, but I think a 30% is enough to pay for the implementation costs, even if it's more on the long run. Savings will most likely come from price reductions, and to a lesser extent from utilization shifts, but I think it's basically the prices that need to go down. And of course, the details of the single payer system and the political and other environmental factors will determine how it will look like and how much savings actually can be made. So these were my last conclusions, and I think right now we can go to your questions and have a discussion about the research.
Thank you so much, Milou. So the analysis that you chose to do with the inflation rate comparison, is that what other countries do in terms of their drug pricing? Like the big ones that you mentioned, that their prices do increase based on their inflation rate for their country?
I'm not sure about examples that use the inflation rate. Well, this is what was mentioned in many articles and what came from the interviews. So that's why I picked the inflation rate, because I thought it sounds like a fair growth rate. But I do know that in New York, they recently made some legislation to control the growth. I think it's just for Medicaid, not for all the payers, but there is an attempt. And the price regulation schemes that they have in the UK, that's basically a growth control. What they say is, it's kind of a complicated system, but what they say is overall, our pharmaceutical costs can grow 3.5%. And then the companies themselves, they can decide for which drugs. So they can still set their own price as long as the overall costs don't exceed the 3.4%. Basically like that. And they come up with that number through like joint negotiations. So the government and the industry, like they have an organization that negotiates for them, but they get together and they decide how much the growth can be that coming year, and then the companies stick within those lines. So there are some examples.
Thank you so much. One of the greatest or largest arguments for, the big differences in the percent of GDP for other countries is that the U.S. is doing all the research and development of the drugs, and these other countries aren't bearing the cost of that, and they're just getting the drugs because of what we've got. How much do you think, I know one of your points was less investors in pharmaceutical companies, which could drive down investments. But what about less innovation and research and development because of the idea that
Yeah, I meant
they may not
investment in
end up
R&D.
on...
Yeah, well, my list of reasons was, you meant this list? Well, you say that in the US they pay for the R&D. I know there is an article that shows that in Europe they do as much R&D as in the US. It's not true that the US pays for all the R&D. So if you compare it, a share of income and expenses, Europe is more efficient in their R&D. Per share what they spend, they produce more new drugs, basically. So I would say the argument that the US pays for the R&D is not true. What I do think is, because if you look at articles which show the growth of R&D costs and the return on investments from pharmaceutical companies, and the pricing, I think the price increase in the US follows the cost of R&D, while in other countries it declines. So I think that might explain the return on investment, because European countries control their cost better than the US, and I think they kind of do get their money from the US, because here they can ask more. So in order to not lose more money, they increase prices here. But I think that's, yeah, it's a difficult problem. It's not
really
true that in Europe they spend less on R&D. I think it's just here they are able to get it back. So, yeah, I still think it's the US problem and not the Europe problem. But I don't know, I think you should create different incentives to make companies invest. Like some people propose that either the government should pay for research, both clinical research and like preclinical research. I don't know really much about that, but I think in that way you can create some incentives by contracting beforehand, and then the one who has the best results or does it for the least money gets the research grant, something like that. But I don't know the details about that.
What about the stifling of innovation argument? Because I think people will say, if you have a single payer in the largest healthcare system in the world, and you are now limiting it to only certain drugs, that decreases the incentive for companies to develop drugs.
Yeah, you cancel out some competition if you would just contract with one manufacturer. So I think that's not the solution. I think even if you have one single payer, you should still contract with different generic manufacturers. And also, maybe a single payer for the entire US is not the solution, but maybe it's better per state. Sort of overall regulated single payer, but the state itself negotiates for their prices. So then it can also be like an experiment which states performs best. But I think there are enough measures to keep competition going, but it's difficult, and you always have the risk of, how do you call that, government failure if they need to regulate that. So.
Thank you.
Milou, this is sort of a follow-up question. If you imagine the blockbuster drug, like, for example, the new antivirals for HCV, and I think that's sort of an often mentioned case, both for what we can accomplish with good research and for the very high price of some of those new drugs. Can you imagine a carve-out where there may be exceptions made for drugs that achieve certain high-value health goals, that for a certain number of years they're allowed an exclusionary, very high price before they're folded into the stricter negotiations associated with the formulary?
Yeah, I think so, because the example you mentioned, that's an example of a curative treatment. So it's just a temporary price hike. And a single payer, everybody pays their share through taxes, you have a very big pooled funding, which can, it can handle a financial shock, what I mentioned, such like this. So maybe in 1 year, you have way more healthcare costs than other years because of such a drug, and you want to treat everybody. I mean, there are still ways that people who are in highest need get it first, or they make some restrictions on who can get it. But I think because this is a curative treatment, that should be stimulated, because in the end, it will save money. And I think it's important to encourage companies to develop drugs like these. So I think they should earn their share because of their great innovation.
Thank you. I could like to follow up a couple of clarifications on the R&D point. In the US, you can go to the FDA website and you have publicly available information that shows that, in fact, is the NIH and many College of Pharmacy and the School of Pharmacies across the country funded by NIH who really put through taxpayers' money, the R&D, in a much larger percentage than the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, the pharmaceutical industry spends more on marketing and advertising than R&D. So that is an important clarification in terms of whose money are we spending on innovation and development of new drugs. The other point regarding to the lack of incentives for certain therapeutic categories or drugs that couldn't be included as part of the formulary, oftentimes that was the argument behind the orphan drugs, where there was an expectation of recovering the R&D money spent because of the small prevalence of rare diseases. And the evidence has shown that many orphan drugs became blockbuster drugs, and still the pharmaceutical companies, even small generic companies, make a lot of money out of them. So I could agree that this study focuses on one specific therapeutic category, and therefore the findings may not be generalizable to other drug classes, but there is still quite a bit of room for marketing. And now my question for your presentation, one of your, and the main difference with the single payer, it's besides the potential for price negotiations and defining a formulary, is the fact that you leverage on the size of the pool, negotiating on behalf of a large pool. So it doesn't have to be necessarily public run, and it doesn't have to be one unique US formulary. We do have in the States many formulary systems with many different payers. It's about getting rid of the middleman, the PBMs and many others in between that get a profit of it. But you mentioned one of your strategies is based on increasing use of generic drugs. In the US, we do, again, depends on insurance companies and payers, but we do use a large percentage of generic drugs.
More than in Europe.
More than in Europe. That was my point.
Yeah.
In many cases, if we talk about Medicaid...
That doesn't mean it cannot get higher.
So to my question for your presentation is, what was your calculation of savings was based on potential increase in the use of generic drugs? What was that specific percentage increase, and where do you see the potential for growing? For example, in Medicaid, it's over 80% generic drug utilization.
The data was from the VA. In the VA, they have a very large share of generic prescribing.
So what was exactly the savings calculated based on an increase of 10% higher use of generic drugs, or 15%?
I think it would shift from, I think it was 83%. No, that was on average. For the antidiabetics, I used rates of 65 and 70% or 75% in the VA. Around that. Because there are many, like all the insulins, they're all brands. And there are a lot of new generation products like the DPP-4 inhibitors, the GT2 and the GLP-1, which don't have generics yet. So therefore, with diabetes, it's complicated because a lot of drugs that are very often prescribed don't have generics. But I think on average, the US has a 86% generic prescription rate, which is higher than, for example, in the UK, it's 84, which is the highest in Europe. But the VA exceeds that. I think they're at 90%. So it is still possible. I think only if you have a really good reason to not prescribe a generic because of, I don't know, allergies or whatever, people should get the brand names. But I think we should accept that generics are just as good as the brand names are in most cases.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, because I practice in diabetes, it's very complex, obviously, right?
Yeah.
The drug example you gave, Januvia, was the first DPP-4 inhibitor out, yet the company has been able to extend its patents. So that has to come into all of this too, to look at benefits with generic use from the FDA is setting some limits on patent extension. And then the negotiations that happen with generic companies where they agree to not sell. For,
Yeah,
you know.
I think that's a very, very large point that there should be more scrutiny to patents. And I think it would be a good idea if you, if you give a patent, you should link the length of the patent to the amount of innovation, which is also difficult because when you grant a patent, you don't know that yet. But I think there are things possible to shorten the patent life because then you have competition sooner. But yeah, it's difficult.
Very nice. Just a couple of questions. One, in Europe, do they have as comparable direct-to-consumer advertising for new drugs as they do in the United States?
Do we have that in Europe?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No.
There are only two countries in the world, the US and New Zealand, that allow direct consumer advertising.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I think it's
I
always
gotta
very
imagine that's gotta
enjoyable
be-
to watch TV here.
And I guess the other part is when you have a savings, obviously there are losers, right? And so who are the proportionate losers and financial losers in that scheme? And what kind of political pull do they have in terms of moving forward in a single payer system?
Good question. I know the National Academy of Medicine recently came out with a report, and they have they made a sort of flow chart with all the steps in the chain and how much money stays within the chain. And I don't know the numbers, but I think in my ideal system, the pharmacy benefit managers are the losers here. And I think it's not fair to get, you shouldn't get all the 30%, which is estimated from the pharmaceutical industry, because I feel they also create value for the money that they, I mean, of course they can become more efficient, and I think we need to take a look at the R&D expenses and maybe how to decrease those costs, and advertising is a big share of cost that should be cut. So I think you could get a lot of money there, but I think you shouldn't cut too much in their profits due to the argument of incentives for investment. But yeah, I think the insurance currently, the commercial insurers and the pharmacy benefit managers, there are like, when I first came here, I've never heard of pharmacy benefit managers because in Europe we don't have that. And it's, the first 3 weeks I was just busy figuring out what they're actually doing. So, but that's my view. This is not from most of the interviews or literature. No, well, thank you all for coming then.